Hi everyone, my name is Diana Hernandez, and this is my YouTube video presentation for week 6. And I was assigned the oral history, introduction, and then chapters 1 through 4. Okay, so we start with the introduction, and the introduction is states that oral history is needed to tell the stories of previous regimes and colonial powers, and which is a contribution to survivor accounts. And he also states that this space is needed, especially for women and racial and ethnic minorities. Chapter 1 is a deep dive of the oral history, and which chapter 1 begins with stating that oral history, it collects memories and personal commentaries of historical significance through recorded interviews. I created a little formula of what the author states that is needed for an oral history interview, and that is a well-prepared interviewer plus an interviewee plus audio slash video format. It goes on to a very deep dive of the earliest oral history recordings, which is from the Zhou dynasty all the way up to the European conquest of the Americas. I found this little bit really interesting because it says scholars argued that oral history was an academic discipline for evidence. And in this case, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered all military branches and civilian agencies of the government to prepare records of wartime experiences, which I had no idea that had taken place with Franklin D. Roosevelt. So I included it on my little tidbits. The whole chapter is filled with really interesting uh, factoids about oral history's history. Then we go on with Alan Nevis, who is a historian and the first modern oral history archives at Columbia University in 1948, which he was responsible for. Then the Harry S. Truman Library was the first presidential library oral history program in 1960, which then became standard practice. One thing that I found really powerful in this chapter is where they state that every story matters. They gave a short story about how in the military someone was only interviewing generals, which, if we want to get all of the history of whatever is happening at that time, we're not only going to review the quote unquote important people, but everybody to include all historical happenings. Then chapter 1 dives into denial and nostalgia, which it states that not all data gathered should be trusted completely. It then talks about the objective versus the neutral observer historian. There could be a problem with memory whenever you're interviewing a person, and that is because people are going to remember how they felt, not necessarily all the facts. And then this is where he states that people remember what they think is important, not necessarily what the interviewer thinks is consequential. Chapter 2 goes into setting up an oral history project. You need to have objectives and goals. You need to account for time. It can be expensive. It gives us an overview of funding, and then it provides some Grant 101 work. Then we go on to chapter 2, which helps identify and select process for interviewees is crucial. The type of equipment that you need. Documentation is very important, and it states that you need to have a log and file for each interview. And then you are going to need the transcripts versus the recordings, and it goes into which one is more important, transcripts or recordings, which we'll get into in chapter 4. And then a little bit more information on chapter 2. You need to become familiar with information that is readily available. Investigate other projects and interviews. Research is necessary to supply the information. You cannot just go set up an interview with not having done all your research. The number of interviews, and you need to have more questions than you need. It should be less than 2 hours, no more than 2 hours. And you need to seek interviewees and reach out via letter or phone call. Okay, chapter 3. For chapter 3, it is all about conducting interviews. Here are the 9 steps that are required to take according to the text. And then chapter 4, which is using oral history in research and writing. So for chapter 4, it states that the American Historical Association has recommendations for individual interviewers. You need to be cautious when you're doing oral evidence. Scholars have a professional obligation to permit access to their sources, and note taking can provide an extra layer to the interview. And then finally, chapter 4 has these really powerful statements that I wanted to include in my presentation. The first one being, oral history makes a critical addition to oral evidence. A trained interviewer who can guide an interviewee's recital of events that he or she may not have thought about for years but can recall vividly when asked. There are some legalities in oral history, and it can be upheld in a court of law, but not all times. And then the last statement that I wanted to include is questioning and disagreement are human emotions and reactions. As an interviewer, you need to learn to navigate these professionally. You are there to facilitate an interview and the interviewee to gather the necessary data. Anonymous sources can at times be necessary during war. And my handout is posted on the Google Drive. So if you go to our YouTube presentation links, and then I made a folder that has the title Oral History Intro through 4. So that is my presentation. Thank you all so much.